Hey creatives, I'm your host, Aylin Wild, and this is my podcast, Empathy Machine. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time, welcome. In this podcast, I discuss films, give you videography tips and tricks, and unpack other creative topics. In today's episode, I'll be discussing the new Netflix documentary, Crip Camp, directed by James LeBrecht and Nicole Newnham, and produced by Barack and Michelle Obama's production company, Higher Ground Productions. I believe this is their second documentary film, their first being American Factory, which is also available on Netflix, and I would highly recommend checking that one out as well. It's a really great film and a fascinating story about the lives of factory workers in the US and the way they interact with the Chinese factory workers brought over by the company from China. But today I'll be focusing on their latest venture, Crip Camp, which centers around the impact of a disability camp called Camp Jened in the Catskills in New York, and how this then fed into a huge disability revolution in America in 1977. The film opens with some archival footage which is interwoven with modern-day interview footage of a disabled man named Jim LeBrecht, which is one of the directors of the film. He starts to talk about his childhood. He says he has a condition called spina bifida, which is when a baby's spine and spinal cord don't develop properly in the womb, and essentially a gap is formed in the spine. And he explains how the doctor informed his parents when he was born that he wasn't going to live more than a few hours, which thankfully wasn't the case. He was sent to public school in the middle of first grade, and he talks about how most disabled children were just sent straight to institutions, so he was lucky in that sense. His dad actually told him, "You're going to have to be really outgoing, you're going to have to go up and introduce yourself to people because they're not going to come to you." He talks about how he wasn't allowed in the Cub Scouts and that he wanted to be a part of the world, but he didn't really know anyone like him. Up to the age of 15, he had to wear a diaper because he couldn't control his bladder. He then had surgery and got a urinary tract diversion, so he had this bag which would leak and he struggled to keep it on. And he describes this constant pressure of being found out. You know, being a 15-year-old kid wearing a diaper. That was until Camp Jened. Camp Jened, as I mentioned, was a camp run from 1951 to 1977 for the disabled who weren't welcome at regular summer camps. We start to hear from other people, both campers and camp counselors, as they call them. One of them says, "This camp changed the world and nobody knows this story." And you start to see footage from 1971 of this camp, filled essentially, as one of the counselors calls it, hippies and disabled people. He says, "I'm not sure who's a camper and who's a counselor." And another one says, "I didn't know anyone handicapped. I was feeling a little anxious about the kids." And another one said, "I had zero experience with disabled people. I know as many disabled people as I know sumo wrestlers. I'm at the front of the bus and I was not prepared for the visual of so many disabled people at one time. And I froze. I became paralyzed with fear." So you kind of get the feeling that none of these people had any idea what they were doing. It doesn't appear as though they received any training for how to deal with disabled people or how to run a camp. And they all look very young. Most of them are still in their 20s. And you're watching this going, this is a recipe for disaster. One of the campers, Anne Kupalo-Freeman, who has dwarfism, describes listening to Woodstock Music Festival on the radio and wishing she was allowed to go. And she says that Jened was like being at Woodstock. She says they were crazy in a good way. And you start to see footage of camp activities, sports like baseball and football, swimming, rowing, dancing, including some campers in wheelchairs being pushed around by other campers or counselors, games, lots of music, including live bands and jamming sessions of the campers themselves with guitars and tambourines and singing. And they're really good too. One of the guys sings this song and bangs on a metal chair and he's singing and it's really just great. There's more footage of flower crowns and smoking, you know, just your typical 70s hippie kids having fun, laughing, singing, and it's absolutely beautiful. Jim says at camp, everyone had something going on with their body. It just wasn't a big deal. And later he says, outside of camp, I didn't feel like a cool kid, but at Jened, I was. Another camper, Denise Shear Jacobson, who has cerebral palsy, which is a term encompassing a group of conditions affecting movement and coordination, she describes it as a utopia. And, everything she says has to be subtitled because due to her condition, she really has to work to move her mouth and her tongue to get the words out. So it's very difficult to understand her speech. But she says that when they were there, it was like the outside world didn't exist. She says at home, some people had a hierarchy of disability. The polios were on top because they looked more normal, and the CPs, which are the cerebral palsy people, were at the bottom. But at Jened, you were just a kid. And she's in this interview with her husband, and it turns out she actually met him at Camp Jened. He also has CP, and he says that his mother actually wanted him to marry a woman with polio instead of CP like he had, so even she was prejudiced against some types of disability. Later in the documentary, Denise describes going to the doctor with severe abdominal pain, and the doctor decides to immediately send her to get an operation for appendicitis without checking to see if it was something else. And through the surgery, they discover a healthy appendix, and it turns out that she had gonorrhea from a bus driver she'd slept with. So essentially, her doctor had thought it so improbable that she was sexually active that he hadn't even bothered to ask her or check for something else before admitting her to surgery. So she says she went back to school and got a master's in human sexuality, which I thought was just so brilliant. And her husband went to grad school for computer science and later became a bank vice president. She ended up becoming a writer, and they had a healthy son together. So there are so many beautiful kind of mini stories in here as well, which just makes it all the more endearing and moving. But getting back to the camp, most of the campers are sort of aged around 15 to 18-ish, with a few older campers as well. And most of the counselors are also around 20. And a lot of them also had disabilities. And you're watching all this great footage thinking, who's filming this? How are they getting all this footage and with microphones and all that stuff? And the documentary fairly early on kind of answers that for you. So they apparently did have a documentary crew called the People's Video Theatre capturing the camp activities, and you start to see them appearing more and more in the footage. You can hear them asking questions. The director appears in some shots, and they have this roundtable discussion with some of the campers, asking them about their parents and about privacy. And there's also some footage which has clearly been taken by some of the campers, or at least by Jim, because you can hear his voice saying, here's one of our lovely camp counselors, say hi to the camera. They also show the camp director, Larry Allison, who says, when the camp started back in the 50s, it was the traditional kind of camp program. As it evolved during the 60s and into the 70s, what we tried to do was provide the kind of environment where teenagers could be teenagers without all the stereotypes and labels. And then he says, we realized the problem didn't exist with people with disabilities. The problem existed with people that didn't have disabilities. It was our problem, so it was important for us to change. And there's a lot of footage of roundtable-like discussions between the campers, sort of telling their stories. One girl talks about being run over by a bus and that she doesn't even know exactly what her disability is. Another boy talks about how he is blind and hard of hearing from too much oxygen in the incubator and having a fractured skull from falling out of a cab. And there's this tremendous sense that these people are being heard for the first time. It's the first time anyone has actually listened to their story. And, everyone gets a turn, even those, like one girl, Nancy Rosenblum, who is extremely difficult to understand. To me, it just sounds like incoherent sounds, but you can see people trying really hard to work out what she's saying and, interpreting some of it and asking her if what she's saying is what she was trying to say. And she kind of nods. And it's just so lovely to see these people opening up to each other and empowering each other. And they're clearly having a lot of fun. Some of them are really quite hilarious, making jokes to each other and the camera. One of the campers says, at no other camp do counselors treat campers the way they do here. They're not like babysitters. And with that, we're sort of introduced to a 23-year-old camp counselor with polio called Judy Human. And if you don't know, polio used to be very common, but these days it's pretty much non-existent anywhere in the world due to vaccines. But it's basically a viral infection which causes paralysis because the virus attacks the nerves in the spine and the base of the brain. So some people are left permanently paralyzed in their legs. Some people form deformities like twisted feet or legs. And Judy, who's in a wheelchair, talks about how growing up, she didn't really feel very different in her neighborhood. But one day she was approached by this group of kids who asked what was wrong with her. And she says that, that day was the first time she realized she was different. She then talks about not being able to be enrolled in the local school because the principal said she would be a fire hazard. So basically she had to be homeschooled by her mother, and she felt very isolated because of that. She was finally enrolled in special ed classes in the basement of the school with the other disabled children. And she says that, they'd call the other children the upstairs kids. She says, in some way, even though we were that young, we knew that we were all being sidelined. And, as she's saying this, she's clearly quite upset. You can hear a lot of hurt in her voice. And apparently a lot of the campers went to special schools or institutions, and they were isolated most of the time. So some of them found it quite hard to adjust to the camp environment because they were so used to being alone. A lot of them found lifelong friends at the camp. And Judy says she never even dated outside the camp, but a lot of them found relationships and partners through it. One of the counselors talks about how they would try to take some of the campers to nearby cafes for ice cream, but they wouldn't be allowed in because they would make the customers uncomfortable. And this is when we start to sort of get a taste of where the documentary is headed. Jim says, what we saw at that camp was that our lives could be better. You don't have anything to strive for if you don't know that it exists. We then see the final night of camp where the campers would apparently stay up all night because they didn't want it to end. In the morning, there'd be tears as they got on the bus. One of them said, we were brothers and sisters there. So you get this sense that through this camp, they had all been fundamentally changed in some way. They had had discussions about how they could work together to make life better for all of them. They had been empowered and started to see how life could be different for them. So clearly a lot of them started thinking about how they could replicate this experience somehow, this experience of being heard and loved and accepted in the outside world. Up to this point, the documentary is kind of very cheerful and upbeat. We hear this almost dreamy 70s music. We hear people laughing and singing. The subtitles, for those campers that are hard to understand, are sort of painted onto the screen in an old typewriter font over the top of this sepia-toned old footage. But then it starts to get a bit more serious. Jim describes how being back home, I had to try to fit into this world that wasn't built for me. Because, at camp, he was the cool, popular kid. He had a girlfriend, he had friends, he would smoke cigarettes and sing songs. And back home, he was the disabled kid again. We hear some audio from an old 70s documentary which says, most animal species abandon or destroy members of the group which are maimed or deformed. Some human societies have been equally harsh. Down through the centuries, our literature and recently our movies are full of monstrous, misunderstood creatures. And there's images of, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Captain Hook. Through this conditioning, we come to think of the handicapped as objects of fear or pity or loathing. Tonight, we look at them as human beings with problems. We then learn that most disabled people, especially those in wheelchairs, couldn't use public transport. They couldn't get on and off footpaths because there was no ramps. And you see this footage of this guy who has to wheel himself around the streets right next to this flow of traffic looking for a way onto the footpath. And this is when it starts to focus on Judy. We see her starting the Disabled in Action, or DIA group, which was a political organization of disabled people and was the result of a lawsuit she brought against the Board of Education in New York City. We learn that the DIA began its focus on institutions such as Willowbrook State Hospital in New York, which we see this seriously shocking news report of. This reporter for Channel 7 News, who is supportive of the group, does this report, and we see footage of patients lying on the ground in the bathroom, covered in their own waste. There's this horrible wailing sound. Almost all of them are naked or have a pair of white underpants on. He says that there is only one attendant for 50 severely disabled children, and that they were only given 3 minutes each to eat because there weren't enough attendants, and a lot of them had to be hand-fed because they couldn't move their own bodies properly. We then hear Jim talking about how he saw this report and immediately remembered this one kid at Camp Jened who had been a patient at Willowbrook, and how he would just come into the dining room with this crazed look and just start eating and eating, shoveling food into his mouth like a crazy person, and that he would then throw it all up because he'd eaten so much. The reporter says that a lot of them would die from pneumonia, and we see footage of these tiny little beds, almost like little crates, with 2 children crammed in together with their legs bunched up beneath them, trying to fit into this bed. I mean, you seriously couldn't make this stuff up. It was like something out of a horror film. And you're going, someone has to do something about this. This is awful. And with that image still in your mind, the film takes you through the other things that were happening at the time. So obviously the civil rights movement was going on, the Vietnam War was going on, and there were a lot of people angry and upset, and a lot of people were protesting different things. So Judy thought it would be a good opportunity for them to get their voices heard as well. The film explains that in 1972, the Rehabilitation Act was drawn up, and there was a section in this act, section number 504, which said, "No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States, as defined by section 7(6), shall solely by reason of his handicap be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." However, President Nixon vetoed this bill due to high cost. We then see an extract from an interview with William Ronan, who was the New York City Transit Authority, and he asks, how many people would really be served by this? And essentially says, that to put elevators and ramps into every train station, the cost would just be so high that it doesn't make any sense. So with that, Judy decides to hold a demonstration in front of the Nixon headquarters, and at 4:30 p.m., so just after or before the end of the working day, 50 disabled people formed a circle across all 4 streets in the middle of New York City and effectively shut the city down. They had signs saying things like, help us break the chains. They had loudspeakers. And remember, these are all young people. I mean, Judy is my age at this point. And Jim says he decided to join them. So he hopped on a train and came through Grand Central Station, which of course has a whole load of stairs. And at this point had no lifts or elevators. So he literally pulled himself and his wheelchair up all the stairs, step by step. And in your head, you're just imagining all these people that must have walked past him at this point, who just watched him struggling. But he made it finally. They then had another demonstration in front of another political building, and you hear an excerpt from this news report. There's a minority in America that has only recently begun to speak up and be heard. They face problems of discrimination and prejudice in employment, education, transportation, and in just about every other aspect of what society considers everyday life. And although they still have very little press coverage, Nixon does eventually sign the Rehabilitation Bill in 1973. However, as either Judy or Jim puts it, no one really bothers to properly enforce Section 504. Judy then sets up this Center for Independent Living, a facility run by the disabled for the disabled, and you kind of get this feeling that she's trying to replicate Camp Jened. She says the goal is to make disabled people self-sufficient. They would help people find apartments or houses. They would help them get around by themselves. They would organize carers for them. And because of this act, they could apply to the government to receive money. And you see a lot of people from the camp are a part of this organization and that they're sort of bringing similar ideas to it. You see footage of this Halloween party where they're all dressed up in costumes and they're having loads of fun. And you get this flashback of one of the campers saying, if you're a handicapped person and you happen to have a passive nature about you, you're really screwed. It's now 1977 and very little has changed, so they decide to hold protests outside the regional offices of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, or HEW. Carter is now in power, and there's a new senator of HEW, Joseph Califano, who is reviewing these policies and trying to delay these laws even further. And there's this footage of him standing up in front of all these disabled people saying, I have reviewed those regulations. There are some difficult questions. The last administration took 2.5 years and decided not to move. I've had 2.5 months. And someone yells, why can't you move now? What are you waiting for? To which he responds, because I want to make sure I understand them, and is then promptly booed off the stage. Jim explains that there were these lobbyists from schools, universities, and even hospitals who were asking for all these changes to be made to the regulations so that they wouldn't have to make all these changes to their buildings to make them wheelchair accessible and easy to navigate for blind people. These protesters then decided to stay outside his office and shout, sign or resign, until he signed the regulations. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, we see this huge group of about 300 disabled protesters outside the Department of HEW, and we see them actually enter the building. They then travel up to the 4th floor outside the office of Joseph Maldonado, who was the regional director of HEW, and they ask him to make a phone call so they can speak to Califano. He refuses, they become angry and say they're being ignored, they're not being heard. So they decide to stay in the building overnight. And we hear Judy talking about taking a vote to see who wanted to stay, and many of them did. They then had even more people come and join them, and we see footage of them singing Solidarity Forever. And you have to remember, these people are disabled. I mean, even regular healthy people would find it tough staying overnight in an office building, but a lot of them needed ventilators, care attendants, catheters. Some of them were quadriplegics who needed to be turned in the middle of the night to prevent body sores, and they were all sleeping on the floor. We then learned that this overnight stay became something much bigger. It became a full-on sit-in and the longest non-violent sit-in in America's history to this day. A lot of people from Camp Jened were there, and Judy was essentially the leader. One of the campers says she would never start a meeting without a sign language person there to interpret. She always made sure everyone was heard. She would make sure everyone felt important. She'd go around and individually plead with people to stay just one more day. And people would come in and bring them supplies. The water was turned off to the 4th floor to try and drive them away, and the FBI had their phones cut to stop them communicating. So ingeniously, the deaf people would sign out the windows to communicate with people on the ground. One of them built a fridge by attaching some plastic and cardboard and other things to an air conditioner. The Black Panthers would come in and bring them hot meals for dinner and more supplies for breakfast and lunch. And one of them asked them, why they were doing this, because they didn't have any resources. And they said, if you're going to go to the trouble of sleeping on the floor, we're going to make sure you get fed. They had a cafeteria, a conference room, there were mattresses all over the place, they had supporters coming in from everywhere, including the mayor of San Francisco. People would send in mattresses. A local hair bar came in and brought shampoo and washed everyone's hair. And we hear one of the campers saying, the world always wants us dead. Disabled people know that every day of our lives. The world doesn't want us around and wants us dead. And clearly this drive birthed from this knowledge pushed them to their physical limits to fight for their rights in this way. A lot of them also went on a hunger strike and would only drink liquids. And we hear that the local media pretty much ignored the entire event. So it was really just Channel 7 reporting on it again, which I just think is astonishing considering what they were doing. And because they weren't really getting anywhere with this, they then pushed for some congressmen to come to the building to speak with them. Only 2 of them showed up, one of whom was a representative of Califano, and he basically tells them the changes that they are being advised to make to this Section 504, of which there are over 20. And one of these changes was essentially a segregation law where they would be separate but equal to the rest of society. And Judy kind of graciously responds by essentially saying, you clearly haven't heard anything we've been saying. What is wrong with you people? So they decide to send some of them to DC itself to speak with the president in person. And they had to use this removalist van once they got there to get around. So there's these 25 disabled people in wheelchairs piled into the back of this removalist van in total darkness on their way to Califano's house. And it shows them holding a candlelight vigil there, which he promptly ignored. They also had over 100 protesters marching in front of the White House, but Carter refused to see them. One of them says they went 36 hours without sleep 3 times that week because they were so determined, but no one would meet with them. And back in San Francisco, we hear that the FBI has been using 3 a.m. fire alarms and bomb scares to try and remove these protesters from the building. And you're just thinking, why is no one paying attention to any of this? Surely something has to give. Eventually, due to media pressure, Califano does sign the regulations the way they wanted after 27 days of this sit-in. And we learn that some of these people had been on a hunger strike for 23 of those days. As a result of the bill, all universities had to make their campuses accessible to the disabled and provide interpreters for the deaf and blind. All new housing made using federal money had to be made wheelchair accessible, and curb ramps were installed into city streets. One of the interviewees says, "When 504 told me I had value, it hit home." And you feel a sense of relief and pride that they finally made it. However, we then learn that most public transport was still not accessible. Employers could still discriminate. A lot of buildings, like private businesses, were still inaccessible because they weren't using federal money. So it turns out that they still had a long way to go and that they would be fighting the government all the way. And then you have this montage of more protests through the 80s to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. Judy, speaking to government officials in the early 90s, trying to get new laws passed, says, "We as disabled persons are here today to ensure for the class of disabled Americans the ordinary daily life that non-disabled Americans too often take for granted. The right to ride a bus or a train, the right for any job for which we are qualified, the right to enter any theater, restaurant, or public accommodation. The passage of this monumental legislation will make it clear that our government will no longer allow the largest minority group in the United States to be denied equal opportunity. To do any less is immoral." And in 1990, that law was passed. But Denise says, "You can pass a law, but until you change society's attitudes, that law won't mean much." The film then ends with some of the campers coming back to the campgrounds and reminiscing about their time spent there and the trajectory that it took their lives in. So, talk about a life-changing summer camp. I thought this documentary was absolutely beautiful. It really has so much respect and heart for its subject matter, which makes sense considering one of the campers directed it. The 70s soundtrack fits perfectly, maybe a little cheesy, but I don't really care. I love how it takes these people and rather than depicting them as poor, sort of pathetic, damaged humans, like a lot of disabled documentaries have a tendency to lean towards, it kind of flips that idea on its head and says, the problem isn't with the disabled community. We're all fine and dandy. And yes, we have issues just like everyone else, but our biggest problem isn't our disability. It's dealing with the prejudices of a society that was never built for us and has very little intention of accommodating for us because we're a minority group and are traditionally seen as weak. And I think through this documentary, we can really see just how far from weak these people really are. And I was thinking as I was watching it, if we as people are shaped by and strengthened by our trials and our challenges, surely these people must actually be some of the strongest in our society, which is quite a different way to view them from what we typically see. And I think it's really important that we shift away from this victim mentality of feeling sorry for these people and rather seeing them as displaying their issues, which we all have, on the outside rather than having them hidden away like the rest of us. I was reading an article about this film and it was written by a woman with a disability, and she was saying that it's so rare for a film like this to even exist because most disabled people don't live long enough to actually tell their tale. So there is very little documented history of disability. And she was saying, it's so nice to finally have something to show people and say, this is what happened. This is our history. And I think one of the most astounding things to me was the timeline of this. And yes, this is set in America, but the story in the UK is almost identical. Anti-discrimination laws here were only passed in 1995. Prior to that, disabled people were considered feeble-minded. There was no welfare support system for them. So this is not just America's story. And I really love the way the film weaves the simple story of a summer camp into this really powerful tale of liberty and breakthrough for this huge and important minority group in our society. It takes this simple story, which we can all relate to, and leads you through the process of how this was then transformed into something amazing. And in that way, it becomes extremely relatable for everybody. All the way through, we're reminded of the role this camp has played in this situation. We see the characters set up at the beginning of the film. We then hear about how they took the things they learned there back to their everyday lives. And then we see the consequences of it with these monumental acts of courage. And then again, right at the end, we hear this familiar 70s music again. We see the old black and white footage of the camps. And we're reminded of where this all began. If you enjoyed this film, there's another film called The Best of Men about the first Paralympic Games, which is fantastic as well. It's not a documentary, but it's still a really moving story. There's also a film on Netflix called The Fundamentals of Caring, which is great. It's about a care worker and the teenage boy he's looking after, and it's really sweet. Overall, I loved this film. I've seen it twice now, and I just think it's so powerful and eye-opening, as well as engaging and inspiring. So if you haven't seen it yet and you love inspiring stories about overcoming odds, you will love this. My 10 film picks for this week come from Netflix UK, and the category is films to watch in your PJs with a hot chocolate. In alphabetical order, the films are Begin Again, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Isn't It Romantic, Kiki's Delivery Service, Safety Not Guaranteed, Sense and Sensibility, The Breakfast Club, The Fundamentals of Caring, Unicorn Store, and What If. Head on over to alienwildmedia.com/film lists and let me know which of these is your favorite and which feel-good film that's not on there that you think people should check out as well. Okay, that's it for today's episode on Crip Camp. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If this episode inspired you at all, please don't forget to leave me a review. That would be really helpful. And I'd love to hear your feedback and any requests you might have for future episodes. Also, check out the show notes for this episode at alienwildmedia.com/podcast. I hope you have a great week and tune in next time for more creative insight into my experiences in the world of video and film.